The Islamic Golden Age was an unprecedented era of literary, medical, philosophical, and scientific development within the Muslim world. It is generally dated between 750 and 1260, though some scholars consider it to have peaked between 750 and 950. Knowledge of this era has become widespread in the West, communicated mainly through the public education system and popular culture, and, to a lesser extent, through Muslim apologists online. In contrast, the European Middle Ages, dated from 400 to 1400, have historically been known as the Dark Ages. The Muslim world during the same period is popularly depicted as scientifically advanced, technologically sophisticated, and medically skilled. This depiction has become so well recognized in the West that works of popular culture typically take it for granted. However, the truth is very different. Here are 4 misleading claims about the Islamic Golden Age. Claim number 1. It is claimed that European scholars lost nearly all the Greek and Latin scientific texts after the fall of the Roman Empire. In reality, the Greek sources of those Arabic translations were not neglected. It is true that when the Roman Empire collapsed, Western European scholars found their access to Greek classical writings severely limited. This was caused firstly by the rise of Latin as the lingua franca of the West, so that knowledge of Greek became scarce, and Greek texts could not be read. However, it was not because the classical texts themselves were destroyed, or because they were no longer being copied. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy explains, quote, "They were not lost in the sense that the texts were simply unavailable, but in the sense that very few people could read them since they were written in the wrong language." End quote. In England and Ireland, copies of the Greek philosophical texts were copied and studied by scholars such as Alcuin of York in the 8th century, John Scotus in the 9th century, and Adelard of Bath in the 12th century. Consequently, historian of philosophy Frederick Copleston wrote that modern research into the transmission of the Greek classics has shown, quote, "It can no longer be said that the medievals had no real knowledge of Aristotle." End quote. Claim number 2. It is claimed that Muslim scholars preserved countless Greek and Latin texts by translating them into Arabic, preventing them being lost forever. However, they were already being preserved largely by Byzantine Christians in the East and partly by Christians in the West. The whole reason for the translation of Greek texts into Arabic was not for the purpose of preserving them. It was because Muslim scholars could not read Greek or Latin. Franz Rosenthal, who was the Sterling Professor Emeritus of Arabic at Yale University, noted that the famous 9th and 10th century Muslim commentators on the Greek texts did not actually know how to read or write either Greek or Syriac. Since they could not read the Greek texts themselves, Muslim scholars paid Christian and Jewish scholars to translate these works into Arabic for them. The Christian scholar Hunan ibn Ishaq al-Ibadi was fluent in Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Arabic, and was known by his Arab contemporaries as the Sheikh of Translators. As head of the famous House of Wisdom, the great library and education center in Persian Baghdad, it was this Christian scholar who led the translation movement of the Islamic Golden Age. Claim number 3. It is claimed that Western scholars only started recovering these texts in the 13th century, when they finally had access to Arabic translations, which they then translated to Latin. However, the fact is, Arabic translations of the Greek texts did not start to find their way to the West until well after the West had already recovered almost all of the original classical tradition, directly from superior Greek texts. French philosopher and medievalist Jean Jolivet noted that some works by Euclid and Ptolemy were recovered via the Arabic translations. Nevertheless, he also wrote that, quote, "Most of the works of Aristotle, however, were translated directly from the Greek and only exceptionally by way of an Arabic intermediary." End quote. He concludes, quote, "Translations from the Arabic must be given their full importance, but not more." End quote. Claim number 4. It is claimed that Western science and technology had completely stalled after the fall of the Roman Empire and was suddenly propelled forward as a result of the immense knowledge they received from Muslim commentators on Greek and Latin texts. In fact, the works of the prominent Arab Muslim thinkers were not translated into Latin until the 12th century, by which time the Western recovery of Aristotle was already almost complete, the Western revival of the Greek scientific tradition had already been taking place for at least 200 years, and groundbreaking progress had already been made independently of any influence from the Muslim world. Despite acknowledging Islamic contributions, Islamic scholar Muzaffar Iyobal says that modern science is, quote, "a purely European phenomenon," end quote, and, quote, "ultimately a product of Western civilization," end quote.